down. So good afternoon, everyone. If you are here to deep dive into the world of changing futures, then you're definitely in the right place. I'm Andrew Laird. I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures and also the host of the Radical Reformers podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Collette Le Van-Gilroy, who is the SRO for Changing Futures Surrey, and also Mark Smith, who is currently a visiting professor of Public Service Innovation at Manchester Met University and former SRO for Changing Futures Northumbria. And we're also lucky enough to have Mark working with us on a number of our projects. So I will ask them to introduce themselves properly shortly, but to set the scene, the government's current public service reform agenda is pretty clear. Move away from top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions and instead empower local areas to test, learn and grow. That's the phrase that they've been using. And the Changing Futures programme is a powerful example of this in action and has been openly pointed to by the government as a model to learn from. The Changing Futures programme included 15 partnerships from across England, and they've been supporting people experiencing multiple disadvantage through relational approaches and embedding a culture of learning and iteration. And as we speak, you'll find that that is so important. But, and it's a big but, the national funding is confirmed only until March next year. So the challenge is pretty clear. How do we avoid Changing Futures becoming a cult project, inverted commas, innovative but isolated? And how do we ensure that this important work doesn't end when the funding does? So to expand on that core question, we will be challenging ourselves and you listening to consider why relational approaches work for people but still remain the exception in public services. What role does test, learn and grow play in supporting relational public services? And what's needed to create the enabling and sense-making environments, and maybe Mark will say a bit more about those, that make these approaches possible and sustainable. So in terms of housekeeping, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you're watching. We are recording this and I will make the recording available to anybody who wants to re-watch it if you're that way inclined or share with colleagues. So Mark and Collette, warm welcome onto Mutual Ventures podcast. Collette, I think this is your inaugural podcast with us. Mark, you've done many of them. So Collette, I'm going to start with you. Could you just briefly introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about your role in relation to the Changing Futures programme? And you'll just have to come off mute there. Sorry, I made everybody go on mute, and that's my fault.
There, okay. So
that's it.
Hi everybody. My name's Collette Le Van, and I suppose how I got the journey I made really and into the role that I have now is that I worked in outreach. So outreach for homeless people in Glasgow with St Mungo's for about 3 to 4 years when I was at uni. And at uni, I studied nutrition, dietetics, and psychology. And I specialized in clinical dietetics, mainly for adolescents. So a lot of people with eating disorders. So that's where the psychology came into it. Then I did work for the NHS for a few years, but then I went back to restudy and I studied commercial and contract law. And then from there, I used the nutrition, dietetics, food science side of life and the law and went into retail buying. So I was a buyer for Marks and Spencer's, but on food for many years. Then an opportunity came up in Kensington and Chelsea to open up a commercial department, which we did. And really at that time, I specialized in adult social care. So it was a lot of things like meals for the elderly and etc. You'll all know what adult social care means, I'm sure. Did that for quite some time. And then I moved into children's social care and worked collectively with Kensington, Chelsea, Hammersmith and Fulham, and Westminster over a period of 28 years. So operating frontline services and also doing commissioning programs And that obviously meant working an awful lot inside the communities. And then throughout all that work and all my own sort of private life, I kept coming across people that had various complexities in their life, now known as multiple disadvantage. I'm sure we all know some personally. And then this opportunity came up in Surrey to join the Public Health Department of Surrey County Council. And that was in 2021. At that time, I was actually working for Hackney City. Moved over to Surrey, wasn't so sure about Surrey because I'd lived in Surrey for like 35 years. And it was very different to working in the middle of London, but I thought, okay, we'll give it a go. Then met a fantastic team. So the public health team in Surrey County Council are very forward thinking, I would say, and met an absolutely fantastic team. And collectively, we knew that there was a cohort of people that we needed to tackle, we needed to try and find some solutions for. And then, remarkably, the Changing Futures tender came out, and we quickly got together 27 system partners and many of the VCSE organisations across the Surrey landscape. And collectively, we put a bid into Changing Futures. And our bid at that time, I mean, we co-designed the whole bid, obviously, it took some time. But it was all about this. There was two main strands to it. The first strand was all about the strategic transformation for Surrey in respect to multiple disadvantage. And the second strand, which hadn't really been very well formed at that time, was about putting in a frontline relational model. Now, when we got the money, which I'm delighted that we did, so we had funding for 3 years initially, and then an additional 2 years funding. And we managed during the additional 2 years to lever in additional money from places like the OPCC, local ICBs, etc. And that's helped us to keep going and expand somewhat over the last 2 years.
Collette, would you mind just saying what OPCC is?
Oh, sorry, Office of the Police and Crime Commission.
Got it.
Yeah, so we got Office of Police and Crime Commission money. And then as things have expanded, we've been asked to take over some rough sleeper services and things around Surrey. So yeah, it's been gradual, but we've gradually built up the service. And that's
fantastic.
Really.
No, really good. Quite a personal journey you've been on as well, which is really interesting to hear. I'm going to come back to you in a second just to get you to explain in a bit more detail the Changing Futures Surrey program. But Mark, many of our listeners today will know you, but just if you wouldn't mind briefly introducing yourself in case anybody doesn't, and just say a little bit about how you managed to get involved in the Changing Futures program.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I was the Director for Public Service Reform at Gateshead Council, and I had been since 2015. And I'd been working while I was there on trying to essentially close the internal purpose from the council's point of view was to close the financial gap. But the external view was, why don't we make people need acute services less by helping them to create the kind of relationships they need in their lives to thrive? Because no amount of cutting is going to attack the demand question. So we really wanted to understand how we might better help people that we weren't very good at helping. And I say we, I mean a collective, not just the council. So a background in consultancy. I spent some time at Vanguard, and I was at councils before that in Liverpool and Warrington and Cheshire, various places. But as Gateshead, I was asked to do this reform role. And so for a number of years before Changing Futures came along, we developed a series of methods which enabled us to start where people are and meet them there and work outwards. And to ask the question, when you do that, where does it rub against the system, and what's that telling us about the system, so that we might change it and make this stuff normal. So we'd run a series of prototypes around helping people with council tax debt, homelessness, working on an area basis, and then Changing Futures came along, and it seemed to be a natural evolution from where we'd already established a decent method, but we knew we wanted to add to it. So we went from Gateshead to Northumbria, and I co-wrote the bid with some brilliant people that are still running Changing Futures Northumbria. I'm not there anymore. I haven't been for a few months, but people that are there are absolutely brilliant. So if you want to talk about where it is, talk to them. But they, we wrote that bid to try and scale this up, but also to do it in different places. We wanted to understand that actually, if you're helping somebody whose presenting issue is alcohol or whether it's homelessness, actually, once you get past the presenting issue, the issues are broadly, there's a similar degree of complexity. So let's not treat them as if they're different. So we wanted to work on that. And that's kind of where we got to. But one of the things that we said, all of us, the team of 4 of us that wrote the bid, and two of us are still there, 2 of them are still there, was that we felt that Changing Futures was important, but it was the project before the one we needed. Because as Andrew said, we don't want to have cult projects developing. This has to be the one before the one that really does it. So we designed it on that basis. It wasn't about perpetuating it. It was about presenting a case for change. So that, I think, is where we entered into the Changing Futures sort of spirit, by trying to build a case for change rather than perpetuate a program.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think that's a really interesting journey you've been on as well, which is quite different from Colette's actually. But I think along your journeys, you've both realized the same problem that needs solving. Collette, I'd love to give you an opportunity now just to describe the work that Changing Futures does in Surrey. And I know from talking to you before, you've got a few good examples, case studies that really bring it to life. So I'll give the floor to you to just explain what you've been doing.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier there are 2 main strands. So the first strand is all the strategic transformational change. And then the second strand is called Bridge the Gap, which is the frontline relational model. So if I just go back to the strategic transformational change, because it's very important, they're all very, very interlinked. But first and foremost, like all Changing Futures areas, everything was based on a trauma-informed platform. So one of the things that we started to do was to put in a trauma-informed approach right across the Surrey system. And initially we used our local NHS Foundation Trust, the Mental Health Foundation Trust, which was fab. But we then started to introduce frontline delivery of training and practice development, etc., for which we used Homeless Link. So that's working with librarians, community police, anyone that might meet people with multiple disadvantage but hadn't quite recognized what it was and what trauma might have sat behind it. So from the beginning, so from 22 till now, I think we've had about 3,500 people on trauma-informed training and followed that through with practices. And for anybody on the call that's from Sussex, Sussex has actually got the most fantastic sort of practice development unit. It's run by Louise Patmore, and she's carrying that forward in Sussex. So we're working a bit with Louise on things behind the scenes to keep that going. And then another really important part of our bid was that we would set up a lived and living experience community of multiple disadvantage called a LERO, R-E-R-O. And the LERO really are the voices for people with multiple disadvantage in Surrey. And one of their fantastic pieces of work was that the LERO co-produced with an author a JSNA, so that's a joint strategic needs assessment for multiple disadvantage in Surrey. And I think it took about 18 months, but eventually they were invited to present their own findings to the Health and Wellbeing Board. So that was quite unusual for Surrey, that A, there would be a LEO, but secondly, that the LEO would be invited to a public meeting to present their findings. I think some of the findings were slightly controversial, shall we say, because they were written in the eyes of the end user. But certainly we've had a lot of really welcoming feedback, and we're trying to
I mean,
work forward.
that's a public document now. Is there anything you can remember that was particularly controversial?
Oh, there's lots that we've particularly got to. There's 11 recommendations,
Yeah.
and some of them are calling in for reviews of other services that
Maybe people who weren't expecting to be in the firing line.
maybe, yeah. There's 11 of them, and it's published and beautifully written. I think the author is actually on the line just now, and beautifully written and really well regarded in Surrey, right?
Yeah.
And the recommendations, one of them is to put in a governance system for multiple disadvantage. So that's bringing all our partners together. There are governance systems for many things, but not multiple disadvantage. So that's one big recommendation that's going forward. And then another big part of the project at that strategic level was feeding everything up to the government and then getting everything back down from them, from MHCLG. And I must say they've been a fabulous colleagues to work with. They're always listening, always questioning, always listening, which is great. So then from that, the Surrey community, so all our partners that had put in the bid and the Leo and everybody else were saying, look, we need to have a relational model of outreach. So that was
before, Collette, sorry for interrupting, just before you get into that, your 11 partners, because I just want to get people to understand your delivery model, if you like, because you were not delivering a lot of this in-house, were you?
No, we don't deliver anything in-house.
Yeah.
This delivery model, we commissioned out to the local VCSE assets. So there are mental health, homeless, and domestic abuse charities. There's 12 partners, and we commissioned them. Between them, they've put in 22 staff. And then behind all of those staff, we've had a consultant clinical psychologist work alongside them. There's now a new clinical psychologist who's working with them, but they work full time with those staff to make sure that the trauma-informed approach was true to everything that was being done with the clients. Okay, so they were working day to day with the outreach workers, and obviously there was reflective practice and everything put into that. And then we have 6 weekly trainings. So there's workforce development every 6 weeks for the outreach practitioners, plus reflective practice. And that has meant, from start to finish, in all the feedback and testimonials and thanks and everything that we get from the clients, I think it's fair to say we have managed to keep it very, very trauma-informed for the clients. And that's having wonderful outcomes. So we've had 4 national evaluations and 2 local independent evaluations. And the outcomes for the clients are really quite sensational. So it's all done what's called an outcomes wheel. And fantastic results. And we have to take our hats off to all those outreach workers that are doing all the work, because we're not, but they are. And it's fantastic.
And would you just maybe give like an example of someone who's been helped? And I know when we spoke last, you were able to kind of give an estimate of the savings that were associated with that as well. And I know it's difficult to get into that side of things so quickly, but with the pressure that public services are under, I just think the huge impact that programs like this can have on demand and things is really important to highlight as early as possible. So could you just unpack that a bit, please?
Yeah, okay, so we are still working on our return of investment, but we've got some case studies that we've had analysed, and one of them is a client who's a Section 117.
And that is, sorry, Collette, you'll have to tell people what that is.
Yeah, so that is a package that's shared between the ICS and adult social care.
So between the NHS and the council,
Yeah. And so the package of care came out about £182,000 a year. The client had been on that package of care for 3 years. And at some stage, somebody said it isn't working, so let's try Bridge the Gap. And we put in
And Bridge the Gap is the name that you've given to your approach in your changing future.
Yeah. So Bridge the Gap is a relational outreach model. So we assigned an outreach worker. In order to assign the outreach worker, there's a multi-agency panel, and we really do go into the depth of the client's history. So we've got access through all our data sharing agreements and everything into about 67 different databases. And then the clinical psychologists help us allocate which outreach worker would be the best match for that client. And within a year, the client no longer had any care packages. So the savings came out at 175,000 net savings for that one client, who's still a client and whose mother has written some of the most wonderful testimonials and sent it around the council and the NHS to tell them how wonderful it all is. That's just one client. There are lots of other clients, and it is quite difficult to get the absolute bones of it. If you haven't got something like a Section 136 or a Section 117, you're digging around looking for tiny little bits of information. I can come back to that later.
No, that's really brilliant, Collette. Thank you. And I know Mark, I could see him nodding there, will recognize a lot of this. Certainly the work that Ron Charlton has done digging around trying to find all those little bits of information. Mark, can I bring you in just to reflect on that, but just also anything that is different about Changing Futures Northumbria? I think the delivery model is quite different, but a lot of the underlying ethos is very similar.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fascinating things about this. There's so many ways to come at this, but there is a common heart to it, which is about meeting people where they're at and working outwards from there, and then figuring out secondarily, if that's a word, what we need to do to make that normal. So the way we designed Changing Futures Northumbria was that we had 4 different sites. And so we're engaging with lots of different partners in public and voluntary sector, and we wanted to. One of the issues we had with Changing Futures when we wrote the bid was that they insisted that we, for eligibility purposes, we had to be sure that everyone we worked with had 3 out of 5 particular things going on. Well, we decided we weren't screening people anymore because they've been screened to death. So we said, we're not doing that. We're don't give us the money if this is a deal breaker, but we're going to go to 4 places where, to quote one of the colleagues that wrote the bid, if you threw a stick in there, you'd hit somebody who had the criteria. So why screen them again? So we ultimately ended up having what we call touch points, teams based and allocated to high consuming cohort in A&E, the alcohol care team in Sunderland and South Tyneside, homelessness walk-in centre in Gateshead, and then these all came live at different points, and then women's refuge in Newcastle. And we put the caseworkers that made up the teams came from a variety of different organisations. Half of them had, I'll use the phrase, I don't like the phrase, but half of them were people with lived experience, and half of them were people that were had a kind of quote unquote professional background, and ultimately they became paired up, and they would work with very small caseloads of people that were consuming huge amounts of resources, and were really struggling, and we're in a great amount of difficulty, not unlike the work we'd done before Changing Futures. It was the same sort of proposition. And those teams were led on a day-to-day basis by really skilled people from the community voluntary sector, and we had oversight as a partnership. And what we did is we gave the teams, each of them, a running budget of, I think it was about 20 grand a year. It's theirs. Because so much of what we actually measured this in the end, so much of what needs to happen when you work with somebody on their terms is you need to do a few basic things quickly, and normally you got to go through a myriad of processes. But you want to buy somebody a coffee and talk to them about their life, you should just be able to do that. So they had a running budget, and we gave them, at the time, we gave them just 2 rules, which was don't break the law and don't do any harm, and basically a series of principles around understanding people and not assessing them. Things like the decisions are made in the work, and we don't try and refer people endlessly. We hold on and we'll pull people in, and if we do make a referral, we'll go with it. And these basic human things that you would want with somebody who's trying to build a trusting relationship with you. But what we found was that, okay, we went through a series of iterations around those rules and principles. And as that happened, people got more confident, because it's quite a destabilizing thing to do at first when you're used to pathways that protect you. It's like, but they don't work. So one of the things that we learned is that pathways are there to protect the worker, but they're ineffective, and the system defaults to creating and maintaining a defensible position. Well, that's no good if it doesn't work. So we wanted to really test practice fundamentally by building it outwards. So we had those 4 sites, and as time went on, the teams got more honed in the kind of structured supervision. So various people brought that in, and it became greater than the sum of its parts. So that structured supervision would help us to hone the method, change the principles, and learning became just as important as doing. And one of the things that I sort of was able to conclude from looking at the data was that once you start focusing on learning, you're more productive than when you're focusing on productivity, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but if you're focusing on being busy, it doesn't necessarily mean you're focusing on being effective. And that's the system trap that we find ourselves in. So we were operating a different model based on working outwards, and partners would be involved in contributing and honing their own practice based on what we were learning. And we commissioned or invested in series partners to provide staff and build into this. So it was a very collegiate approach that was focusing purely on a method, and we weren't defaulting to any of the structures and governance that the system had, because we thought they were part of the problem. And what we wanted to do was almost push against that to the point where we said it needs to look like this if information is going to be used to do good and to affect change. So it's a different model, but I think what I was listening to Collette, and I was really heartened by the fact that even if you come at it using JSNA and you go through other routes and you go through SROI routes, you end up at the same place, which is that when you build relationships with people and you've got their back and you stick with them when it goes south, because sometimes sometimes it normally does. There are always setbacks. It works by and large. It works. What we can prove, and we'll come. I know Andrew's going to ask about the data, is that right now it systematically doesn't. So we can argue really strongly that what we've come at this from different angles, and yet here we are. Relational public services are the way to work when it comes to people that have got a hell of a lot going on in their lives. And that right now, that's a massive gap. That's not what the system just doesn't do it. The VCSE do, but they feel rather disempowered and cut off, I would argue. So there's all sorts of things that our 2 approaches, I think, are surfacing. And I think that's really heartening. And if the government are hearing that from more than one place, they're going to start to take notice. So that's great.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just a reminder to people listening, feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. Until you do, I'm going to ask my questions. Mark, follow-up question. So Collette gave a someone it's supporting. Can you just say a little bit on what you think the impact on the team delivering the support was, and how did they feel it was different, and how did it make them feel?
I can do that validly up to where it was when I left back in January.
Okay.
So certainly from that point of view, I think that it's certainly different. And I think there are 3 broad types of people, not necessarily in the program, but 3 sorts of people. There are those that instinctively get this and have almost been trying to do it in secret. So when they see something like this, that, you know, these are the, what I call, this is the curiosity, the curious and furious people that they're fed up with how it is, and they're trying to do it.
This is what Donna calls the Rebel Alliance
Yeah,
sometimes.
kind of. Yeah, it is. It's people that just know it doesn't work, and they'll go above and beyond, but they'll do it on the slide. That's what we want to make normal. Then there's the people that are inclined to do it this way, but are, for whatever reason, non-judgmentally less able or willing to do it. But they kind of see that it isn't working, and they know that if only they could, but if they did, it would cause more problems than it solves for them. And that's, again, said with no judgment. And then you've got those people that just don't see it or won't see it, or for what, again, no judgment, for whatever reason. What we found is that you people would, certainly in that first and second category, would jump into it, love the idea that, I mean, the liberated method was named by the staff in a previous prototype we ran because they felt free. We don't have to go through all these loops. We don't have to collect data for other people. It's for us, which means we don't have to massage it, you know, and we need this data to learn and improve. So why would it be inaccurate? And it felt really liberating. But one of the things that it also felt, I think, remembering the conversations, was that it's quite an exposing experience. At one minute you have a series of things to quote unquote keep you safe, and now you're essentially you're being trusted to use your ability to build a relationship with somebody and to pull on expertise when you need it, to create a way forward, which we know will go up and down. And it can feel quite exposing, I think, for the staff, but actually when it starts to work, it's really uplifting. I remember one of the caseworkers saying that it was the hardest and best job she'd ever had, which I thought summed it up beautifully.
Yeah.
So I think that was what it was like for the people doing the actual work. I think for those of us in sort of management senior positions, well, I mean, I was the SRO for 3 or 4 years or whatever it was, and I was a bit of a lightning rod. I had to shield the team from a lot of, frankly, crap that came from the wider system around what appeared to be threatening stuff around, well, actually, that's not how we do it. That might make us look bad. Well, no one's here to make anyone look bad. This is about learning. But it was important to bear in mind that this is not an easy journey, and it will be unsettling for those people that have proximity to it but aren't in it. It can feel really, really difficult. No one's here to hang anyone out to dry, but it can all feel that way when something you know, an itch you've been trying to scratch for years gets scratched over there. I mean, we used to get things like, well, you know, anyone could do this if they had time and low case loads. And we're like, well, surely that's the point. Surely that's a piece of learning rather than a qualifier for what we're demonstrating is good. So it's rocky, it's bumpy. You have to stick to it. You have to listen and not be stubborn, but you also have to remember, and this is critical, when people are getting sort of heat from the system, you have to understand the system and why it's giving you heat. And sometimes it's symptomatic of a problem. And rarely was it symptomatic of a genuine chink in what we were doing, because it was working. So having to kind of, I suppose what I'm saying is, when you embark upon this work, be ready for that. It's not about winning an argument. It's about being really clear about what the point is. And that's quite energy sapping and time consuming. But what I would say is that it's nowhere near as hard as the work that is being done, but, you know, actually in the work. But all of those things start to play in. And I'll just make one little point, because I've probably overemphasized the difficult stuff. At times it's really joyous work, because one of the things that we were able to measure, I went through the data, was that about half of what the team were doing was completely agnostic of the system that is in there. So no amount of systems change was going to lay a glove on about half of what we did. And that stuff was the very prosaic, everyday stuff that really helped people to make progress. People will come back and talk about what they'd learned. So seeing people learn and seeing better outcomes is a joyous experience. And people wrote, you know, the citizens would write cards and letters to the team. It was lovely, hard won, but lovely. So yeah, it's a hell of a journey, and you know, it's one I think public services as a whole need to go through.
Thank you very much, Mark. And we've had a couple of comments in. So Really nice comment from Lisa Byrne, one of your colleagues, Collette, who I've met. Furiosity is my new favorite word. We have a wonderful team of Bridge the Gap frontline workers who feel so much more empowered delivering this model, and they've grown into leaders in their own right. I think that's a really important bit. You know, everyone a leader seems to be something really positive that comes from this program. And Colette, there's a question from Katrin Busk that I'll summarize as how it, are there very clear, and I'll ask you first, Colette, and then Mark, do you start with very clear kind of recorded outcomes that you hope to achieve for a person that you're working with? Because I think Katrin's saying that sometimes people come back to a service, and if the support isn't there in the intensity that maybe it had been, that they really miss that. So good question. And maybe Colette, do you want to just reflect on that?
Okay, so every single client's different, aren't they? I think that's the main crux of all of this. And the model that we put in it's flexible for the client. So in terms of outcomes, we generally use the outcomes wheel, which is measuring things like housing, motivation, managing money, etc. But it's adapted for the clients because some people take longer. So part of our model was absolutely no time limit on the number of hours a client might need assistance and support. So whilst we were paying the VCSE charities roughly 8 hours a week for each client, the social value that VCSEs were putting in themselves could sometimes be even double that number of hours. So the resource going in was quite remarkable, and the flexibility of the model allowed us to be able to adapt outcomes for each individual to an extent within a framework, but to an extent, because as we all know, it takes a long time to build up a relationship with somebody, and it can be a bumpy ride. So yes, there are outcomes there. Yes, they're all mapped against the outcomes wheel. We collect data every 3 months. Well, we don't personally, but the outreach practitioners do. As Lisa said, they have become very empowered, the outreach practitioners across Surrey. They are true and utter specialists in their own right. And they've now got the confidence to challenge the system on behalf of their clients, which is lovely. So we run a formulation that's called My Story, My Strengths and My Hopes, which is like a little passport for the client. And they can advocate for the client to make reasonable adjustments about anything along the route for the client. So it might be housing, it could be anything else, but that reasonable adjustment should be made for the client in reasonable circumstance. So I hope that answers the question, Cathy.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Mark, I'm sure you'll have a view on that question.
Yeah, I think not only are there not recorded, documented desired outcomes for clients at the start, we wouldn't wish there to be, because that's us, isn't it? That's what we think. So what tends to happen is the people will work with citizens about what matters to them, and that will start off with what matters right now. And what matters right now might be something very, very short term, like I'm scared or I'm cold or I'm skinned or whatever. I remember pre-Changing Futures, we bought somebody a coat. It was the single best thing we could do, because it then meant they weren't freezing cold, and then we could start to have a conversation about why they didn't have one. And then the what matters questions become longer term. And one of the things that's measurable is that one of the joyous things that happened during when I was there was that we started off with these 2 rules about do no harm, stay legal. And because the whole thing was iterated by what the teams were learning, and we put frameworks of learning in so we could see it and hear it and understand it, it became apparent that some people were getting to the point where they were trust was built and things were happening and it was stabilizing, but they were at the point where the extrinsic input had kind of done its thing, or much of its thing, and it would kind of induce people to access their own agency, which they hadn't been doing because they were in desperate straits. some people struggled with that and were nervous about the moving into, actually mostly me now, with the relationship still. No one gets booted off this program, but it's more on them than it is the caseworker. And we realized through looking at the various different cases that was tending to happen when the purpose of the interaction hadn't been agreed. So not the outcome, but the purpose. There's a distinct difference between the two. So by having a conversation up front about, this is who we are, what let's agree what we might do here. And even if that purpose changes, the act of agreeing it is in itself a reinforcing thing, because you're taking control over it, as in a citizen is. So we were finding that people who were able to glide from mostly extrinsic input into their own intrinsic agency driving their own life improvement, they're the ones that had the purposeful conversations up front. The ones where that hadn't happened, that some of them were getting stuck in this loop. So because of that, we added a third rule. It wasn't a principle, it was a rule, which was, so do no harm, stay legal, and agree purpose, but actually agree and iterate purpose. Because that way, the practice is, we've learned and iterated based on what we learned. And what tends to happen is people, it runs its course. People do, if you like, miss some of the support, but in many cases, they're able to absorb that difference because they themselves have more capability. I'd liken it to a vaccine. See, what cures you from what destroys a virus isn't the vaccine, it's your immune system. But it's almost like the extrinsic input stimulates that, but it does the work. And that's the model that we deploy.
Yeah.
And if you do that, and that extrinsic input might require very practical, long-term and specialist input, it's still not enough unless you're bringing out that internal agency, which is not ours to give, but it's theirs to access. So we made it really clear to distinguish up front between purpose and outcomes. And we're much more interested in the former, and we allowed the outcomes, or the outcomes were allowed to blossom as they naturally were going to. So I know that sounds semantics, but it's not. It's a point of principle.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. That was really well explained. But so there's a question in to do with data, and I know I was planning to ask one around data and demonstrating impact and things like that. Mark, I'll just get you as a follow-on, because I know we've talked about this a lot, just to explain the approach in the Changing Futures Northumbria team. And I know Ron Charlton registered to come to the webinar. I hope he's here somewhere, but I've talked to Ron about this as well, and I know that you have a huge amount of appreciation for the work that Ron did. But could you just describe the difficulty in demonstrating this? Even though it makes so much obvious sense, you've still got a finance director who wants to see the return on investment, and where are the savings falling, because they don't always fall within the council. So just describe the challenge of this.
Yeah, I mean, we all know it, don't we? If the start question is what savings can we make, if that becomes the purpose of this work, we end up cutting. And we were much more interested in well, there's two things. There's savings and there's cost avoidance. They're not quite the same. So but what we wanted to do is just demonstrate. I don't know about anybody else, but when you do something new, you get immediately, there is a double standard going on, because you get immediately asked, show me the business case for that. I mean, most of them are works of fiction, let's be honest, but you get asked to write a business case. Okay, show me the business case for carrying on as we are. And we decided to completely and utterly uproot that. So Ron, I think he's on the call, so I'm not going to put him on the spot. Ron is the data information lead at Changing Futures Northumbria, and I asked him to dig up as much transactional history from a small number of people that we were engaging with and supporting, from all the places that they'd been and interacted with. So poor old Ron, he did a brilliant job in talk. First job is get the story. So we built relationship with people, and very patiently over multiple sittings, sat down with people, and they told Ron his story. And he used that information to go with consent to all the agencies where there'd been interaction and asked for this person's data. Now, some people gave it reasonably willingly, but most didn't. And we had to secure 14 data sharing agreements to get it all. It took months, 14. And it was
wow.
Yeah, I'm rolling my eyes. I didn't have to do it. Ron was extremely persistent and got this stuff. But then the data came in and we were able to collate it and we were able to map it. And we were able, and for all these different sources, for over years, absolutely years. And what we could see is that for people that we're working with, they on their own consumed like multiple millions of pounds as a conservative estimate. I remember going through some of the raw data and counted roughly 5,000 different public servants that interacted with one person, and his life had got worse. 2 million quid, 5,800 different assessments. You know, we learned then that an assessment asks how much of what we do can we do to you. That doesn't really ask you what a good life for you looks like. And all of that was obvious. And we noticed that those services whose data we got had all been inspected as kind of good or excellent. So this wasn't that they were doing it wrong. This was the design. This is what it's supposed to do. So we pulled all that together and we created what we called a burning platform. And we did it for a small number of people, just to make the point that whatever business case you're looking for, it not being this is probably the main one. So we were then able to cost our input and look at the trajectory of where it was going and where it now gone. And we knew we could see it after 18 months, 2 years, 90+% decrease in consumption and improving outcomes. Now we know that the road is rocky and we'll see what happens in the future, but you can't argue with that stuff. And it was really compelling, not only as this stuff works, let's do more of it, but we cannot continue like this. So this idea of creating a defensible position is nuts. Let's just do something else.
Thanks, Mark. Collette, I'd like to ask you a similar question, this challenge of demonstrating return on investment for this type of work.
It is a challenge. Okay, so like Mark, we have numerous data sharing agreements. We did it right at the very beginning. I think we did it in a wing and a prayer to some extent, but we got them all through. I think we got about 11 to 12 data sharing agreements in place right at the very beginning. So we could call on data from all partners. The issue is that many of the partners don't have the data that we need, or they don't have the resources to be able to give us the data that they need. That's a huge big issue. And when you're spending public money, the last thing you want to say is let us bring in a consultant, because if we bring in a consultant to help you, it's more money down the drain sometimes. So we've had to be very careful in trying to extract the data. And therefore, the outreach practitioners, they collect and record as much data as they can for us. They hate doing it, let me tell you, but they understand how important data is. We've had many, many conversations. So they give us as much data as they possibly can about the history of the client and about what's happening with the client currently. So unplanned visits, A&E call-outs, ambulance call-outs, all that kind of thing. And we record it, they record it every 3 months, and we're analysing it. And that's really what we're trying to use to prove the return of investment. But locally, people want very detailed local data. I'm going to be perfectly honest. We have been using Northumbria data with consent. Ron knows, everybody knows Northumbria. We have been doing it and using that as a platform and basing some of our ROI on Northumbria and other changing futures areas. Really, in some instances, to give a probe locally, like if we had this data locally, we could respond to you about the local ROI. But if we, by application of national data to Surrey statistics, what we do have, it's coming out with an ROI roughly of 5 to 1. But again, that's using national data. So Everybody wants data. All your directors of finance all want to know what's your ROI and how much cost avoidance, how much savings we're all making. But unless our partners provide the data, we can't respond sensibly. So we continue to use estimates.
Brilliant. Thank you, Collette. I think, yeah, so the challenge out there is, there's an emerging evidence set that this is the right way to work, and where's the business case for not even trying it? So just there's a message on the chat from Ron. He is here and he says we now have a relational measures framework that shows this return of investment steeped in real context from the relationships and anchored in a bottom-up approach. Brilliant. And then somebody anonymous has said we all need more Rons. Mark, did you want to come in on anything there?
Just briefly, just listening to Collette, that yeah, we do need more runs. One of my favourite quotes that I tend to find myself saying was, and I've said this loads of times, that because Ron's an ex-police officer, ex-chief inspector, was that I thought I needed an analyst. What I really needed was a detective, but actually what I needed was Ron.
So
I'm going to embarrass the hell out of him. But what I would say is the whole business case thing. Now, we did it because we knew that was the weapon of choice for making arguments. But what we're really keen to do is answer the question, but challenge the question, because one of the things that makes this work really difficult is we've decoupled learning and evaluation. They've become different, and they're the same. So this evaluation question tends to be something we've already formed up front. Surely the best thing to say, what are we learning?
Yeah.
But did we learn this is a really narrow question. What are we learning is a better one. So we played the game and did the burning platform, but what's really important takeaway from this is just think about the framing of the question and what do you stand to learn from it? Because the ROI stuff helped us tactically, but it didn't really explain what was happening.
Yeah, there's a really good question from Matthew Mezzi here, which I just I've got one more question to ask you both, so just make the response to this quickly. And Ron, feel free to pop an answer in the chat as well. But we've talked a lot about trying to get data from other parts of the system. Have any other parts of the system, like ICBs and ICS-wide bodies, been interested in getting data from the Changing Futures program? Yet. Open question to you both, and Ron, feel free to chip in.
Well, our ICS is very keen to get data from Changing Futures, but that's because we're asking them for sustainability money to continue, because we've been running a pilot for them inside the high intensity unit of the hospitals. So we've taken the top X number of the most frequent and persistent attenders and been working with them long term under Bridge the Gap. So we're trying to analyze the return of investment for the system for those clients. So they're asking us for data, but we're asking them for data too, because a lot of the data sits inside the high intensity units of the hospitals. And it's there, it's just extracting it can be quite difficult.
Thank you. And I have a final question for you both. Big picture question. We all think, and I would suspect most people listening to this are sold on the whole relational person-centered approach being better than old-fashioned new public management, work in silos and KPI things to death. Why is it that despite this growing weight of support for relational working, why do you think it remains the exception rather than the norm in public services? Mark, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, this is something that relates to the point I made earlier on about if this is the project before the project we need, what does the project we need to look like, or what does the thing we need to look like, not a project. And I think it boils down to three things. We affectionately refer to these as Horcruxes. If you like your Harry Potter, you've got to get them all, otherwise this thing ain't going anywhere. This new public management thing. But there are various ways of expressing it. But I've kind of honed it to three. The first is that the way we see places is pixelated according to the organisations and budgets that cover them. And we can't help it. It's so ingrained. We'll think about a place, we'll immediately think about the council, the ICB, and the budgets that lie across it. And it's a reductionist view of a place, and a VCSE must drive them mad. It must drive people mad.
Yeah.
If we do that, we'll never do this. It just won't happen. So those budgets persist, and they can't really interweave the way that life interweaves the things that they're trying to do. So you end up with financial stalemates, that one budget A won't spend more than it might do to do its thing, because it might save budget B in another organization some money. We have to unwrap that. Second thing is that we pixelate people. We tend to look at them through a filter of the specialisms available to us to deploy on them. So somebody will have to present multiply to multiple specialists in order to, and that in itself is problematic and difficult. So somebody is a pixelated view of the assessments we've done of them. And Brian example, 800 assessments, 5,000 public servants, but nobody really knew him. And the third one I've already mentioned is that we decouple evaluation and learning. We decide up front what good looks like and then measure against it. We're just going to keep doing the same thing and miss the things that we need to do differently. Those three things are key, and they've got to change.
Thank you. Collette, same question to you. Why is this not more prevalent as a way of working?
Because for me, it's the way that funding comes down. So the funding's coming down for drug and alcohol, for mental health, for domestic abuse, for housing, to housing, Ds and Bs, and criminal justice, right? So they're all coming down as silos, and they're kept in silos. It's very, very hard to get the budget holders to see a much, much bigger picture. We're getting there, but I think the opportunity that we have is LGR devolution coming up, that I think that is a huge opportunity for us to work on a less siloed basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So Surrey, obviously one of the county councils going through the local government reorganization process at the minute. Excellent. Mark, Collette, thank you so much. There was one final question in there. I think Ron keeps coming up here. Is it possible to do an interview with Ron? So Ron's actually done an interview, a very short one, with me as part of one of the episodes of the Radical Reformers podcast. So I'll put the link to that in the follow-up email. But just from me, Collette, Mark, thank you so much for that really interesting conversation, and brilliant to get the two different examples of, two different Changing Futures programs from very different parts of the country. So thank you so much. And to everybody for listening, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.